As always, Johnny Cash started as a street musician on Liverpool's docks, but his quiet hunger for power turned him into the city's most feared drug kingpin. Until one careless text shattered his empire overnight. Johnny Cash wasn't born into power, and he didn't grow up dreaming of ruling the underworld. He was just another kid from Liverpool, raised in a crumbling brick row house where the walls were thin and the nights were long. His father worked the docks, his mother cleaned houses, and there was rarely enough food on the table. Johnny found comfort in music. As a teenager, he played an old guitar that a neighbor had tossed out, its strings rusty, its wood chipped. He sat on the cold steps outside his home and strummed until his fingers bled, earning nods from strangers passing by. Music was his way out, or so he thought. By his early 20s, Johnny had become a familiar face near the ferry terminals, singing for coins from sailors and tourists. He wore a coat with holes in the sleeves and a hat that had seen better days. People liked him, even pitied him. He seemed harmless, just another forgotten soul trying to survive. But there was another side to Johnny, one that nobody on the streets saw. Behind his quiet smile and soft songs, he carried a restless hunger. Every time someone dropped a pound in his case, he wondered why he was scraping for pennies while others drove past inexpensive cars. He watched flashy men step off ferries with gold watches and fine shoes, and a thought began to take root there had to be a faster way to climb. That chance came one rainy evening when an old childhood friend named Mick stopped to listen to him play. Mick wasn't the kind of man to stop for street music. He wore a leather jacket, smoked strong cigarettes, and had a car with tinted windows. He dropped a note into Johnny's case, then stayed to talk. Their conversation wasn't about songs or guitars. It was about opportunities. Mick was running with a crew smuggling prescription pills from Ireland into Liverpool, selling them to club kids and dock workers alike. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a way in. Johnny didn't hesitate. The first job was simple. Deliver a bag from one side of town to the other. No questions asked. Johnny did it without blinking. Then came another job and another. Soon he wasn't playing for coins anymore. The guitar stayed in a corner, collecting dust as he moved packages for Mick's crew. He learned quickly how to spot a tail, how to talk his way out of trouble, how to stay invisible. What started with pills expanded into cocaine, and Johnny was there for every step of the climb. But he wasn't content to just follow. Johnny had something others didn't: patience and a mind for strategy. While others flaunted their earnings, Johnny kept quiet, saving, observing. He watched who was reliable and who wasn't, who could be trusted and who might crack. Within a few years, he wasn't just running errands. He was making decisions, drawing maps, and pointing fingers. By the time he turned 30, Johnny Cash had gone from a forgotten musician to the man behind the scenes. He moved product across Liverpool without ever touching it himself. His name wasn't shouted on the streets, but whispered in back rooms. He had become something larger than anyone expected, always, and it all began with a broken guitar and a restless dream that music couldn't satisfy. Johnny Cash built his empire differently from every other name in Liverpool's underworld. While others showed off their success with gold chains, designer coats, and flashy cars, Johnny kept himself small. He wore secondhand jackets and boots with worn soles. He drove an old, dented van that looked like it belonged to a tradesman, not a man who controlled millions in illegal shipments. That disguise made him untouchable. The police looked for men who lived loudly, who flaunted power. Johnny lived quietly, almost invisibly, and that made him dangerous. His control spread like water seeping through cracks. It started with one warehouse by the docks, then another in the outskirts. Soon, he had safe houses hidden in plain sight, tiny brick flats that looked abandoned, storage units with rusty locks no one bothered to check. From these places, cocaine, heroin, and pills moved silently through Liverpool's veins. Delivery vans that looked like they carried furniture were loaded with crates. Couriers who looked like ordinary students cycled through neighborhoods with backpacks filled with packages. Johnny had built a system so clean, so unassuming that even rival crews struggled to trace it. The quiet way he operated didn't mean he was soft. Johnny's rise had made him cold. He believed in loyalty, but only if it came without question. Those who worked for him were tested constantly. He'd assign strange tasks, deliver an empty envelope, make a pointless pickup, just to see who followed orders without hesitation. Those who asked too many questions found themselves suddenly unwelcome, and some vanished entirely. Whispers grew about what happened to them. Some said they were buried under the foundations of new warehouses. Others claimed they'd been sent on one-way trips across the water. No one ever knew for sure, and Johnny never explained. What made Johnny even more terrifying was his ability to stay one step ahead. He never spoke directly on the phone, never sent a text in his own name, never kept a record that could be understood by anyone but him. His ledgers were written in code, a strange mix of symbols and numbers that only he could decipher. He burned through cheap disposable phones, sometimes tossing them in the river after a single call. Police knew his name, but they had nothing solid. Just fragments, rumors, and a network that dissolved every time they got close. Even the bigger players respected him, though they didn't like admitting it. Johnny didn't shout, threaten, or flash weapons. He didn't have to. He knew their secrets, the deals they made behind closed doors, the debts they owed, the people they'd betrayed. That knowledge gave him a grip stronger than any gun. Still, his success brought shadows. The more he controlled, the more he feared losing control. He began surrounding himself with fewer people, choosing only those he trusted to breathe the same air. His paranoia grew in small, sharp ways. He'd switch meeting spots 3 times in an hour. He'd demand proof of loyalty from even his oldest allies. On the surface, Johnny looked like the last man anyone would suspect, a quiet figure who blended into the crowd. But beneath that calm exterior was a throne built on fear, secrets, and careful silence. In Liverpool, everyone knew there were gangs and dealers. But Johnny Cash was different. He wasn't just another criminal. He was the shadow behind them all. It wasn't the police who first cracked Johnny Cash's empire. For years, they had chased shadows, raiding empty flats, seizing meaningless scraps of evidence, and hearing Johnny's name whispered but never confirmed. The walls he built were too thick, his caution too sharp. But every fortress has a weak stone, and Johnny's came from the one place he couldn't fully control: human error. The mistake started small, almost laughable. A 19-year-old named Callum had recently Johnny's network. He was eager, desperate to prove himself, the kind of recruit who'd work late nights for scraps of respect. Johnny liked using young runners. They were cheap, fast, and too naive to realize the danger they were in. Callum's job was simple: pick up small parcels from designated drop points, move them to the next stop, and keep his mouth shut. He was told to never touch the phones except when instructed, and especially never to use the drop phones for personal reasons. Rules mean little when youth mixes with carelessness. One cold night, Callum was running late. He had one of Johnny's cheap burner phones in his pocket, the kind that had no names in the contacts and no history to trace, unless, of course, someone slipped up. Callum did. He typed a message to his girlfriend, something harmless, something as ordinary as telling her he'd be late. He didn't know that the phone he borrowed was already on a list. For months, the police had been quietly tracking a pattern. They couldn't touch Johnny, but they could watch his system. They'd intercepted signals, mapped locations, and flag certain devices. The phone Callum used was one of them. His single careless text, an everyday message that meant nothing to him, was the spark they needed. That one text pinged a tower near an abandoned warehouse on the city's edge. Investigators connected the dots quickly. That warehouse hadn't drawn attention before. It looked too empty, too forgotten. But the signal came again the next day and again the day after. Quiet surveillance began. Distant vans watched from corners. Always, cameras hidden in trash bins recorded every movement. When the raid came, it was swift. Police stormed the warehouse and found more than they had dared hope for. Rows of unmarked crates stacked like bricks, the smell of chemicals in the air, and plastic wrapped packages that spoke louder than any confession. On the side of some crates, faintly inked initials were "Found JC." They weren't bold, but they were there, enough to whisper a name the authorities had been chasing for years. News of the discovery spread quickly. Johnny's runners went silent, his middlemen panicked, and the city buzzed with the story of Ghost finally leaving a footprint. Johnny himself felt the walls closing in. For years, he had moved like smoke, untouchable and invisible. But one careless text had opened a crack in the wall he built so carefully. It wasn't the kind of mistake he could patch up. Phones could be burned, safe houses abandoned, but the scent was already in the air. The police didn't just have crates. They had momentum. Johnny knew what that meant. Once the hunt began, it would only end one way. And all of it had started with the smallest of actions, an ordinary text sent by someone who didn't understand that in Johnny Cash's world, there was no such thing as ordinary. The raid that shattered Johnny Cash's empire came before the city even woke. At 4 a.m, unmarked vans rolled silently through Liverpool's empty streets. Teams of armed officers moved like shadows, hitting every location that had been tied to Johnny's network. The air was thick with fog and tension as steel doors were rammed open. Safes were ripped from floors and every hidden corner was exposed. In a matter of hours, places that had been considered untouchable. Warehouses, flats, even the back rooms of quiet pubs were torn apart. The damage was immediate. Cash piles that had been carefully laundered for years were seized, uncut product burned, and ledgers written in Johnny's strange codes confiscated. Police smashed secret compartments in furniture, tore up floorboards, and dragged out hidden crates. They found guns wrapped in oilcloth, passports under false names, and a network that suddenly didn't look so invincible. But the one thing they didn't find was Johnny. When the first raid hit, Johnny slipped away. He had always been cautious and always had escape plans for moments like this. He left the flat where he had been staying with nothing but a jacket and an old guitar slung across his back. For a short time, he seemed to vanish, just like he had always done when trouble got close. But this time, things were different. The raids weren't isolated. They were coordinated, relentless. For 3 days, Liverpool held its breath. The media ran with headlines about the ghost Kingpin, and every street seemed to have its own rumor. Some claimed Johnny had already fled to Ireland. Others swore he was hiding in tunnels beneath the city. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Johnny wasn't running to start over. He was drifting. He moved from one safe flat to another, knocking on doors that once opened without question. This time, fewer doors opened. Fear was spreading through his network, and so were betrayals. The people who had once sworn loyalty started thinking about their own survival. The police were offering deals, lighter sentences for information always, and suddenly Johnny's name was being spoken in rooms where it had only been whispered before. Allies who had eaten at his table and sworn to protect his secrets were signing statements and drawing maps of where he had been. Johnny's paranoia, which had once kept him safe, now turned into mistakes. He doubled back on his routes, called the wrong numbers, left things behind in flats he abandoned too quickly. His careful discipline was cracking. He wasn't the calm, invisible figure who had built an empire. He was a man hunted, and it showed. The end came quietly. On the third night, officers traced him to a crumbling flat in a forgotten part of the city. He wasn't armed, and there was no dramatic standoff. When they broke down the door, they found him sitting on the floor, barefoot, holding the same guitar he had once played on the docks. He didn't fight when they cuffed him. He didn't speak. The Kingpin, who had ruled Liverpool without leaving a fingerprint, was finally caught, not with an explosion of violence, but with the silence of a man who knew the game was over. His empire had been built in whispers, but now it was falling apart in plain sight, and Johnny Cash was at the center of it all, watching it crumble with nothing left to do. In the courtroom, Johnny Cash no longer looked like the ghost who had haunted Liverpool's underworld for more than a decade. He sat at the defense table in a cheap suit that didn't fit, his hair cut unevenly, his face hollow from weeks in custody. The quiet man who had once ruled from the shadows seemed small under the harsh fluorescent lights. But the weight of his empire filled the room. Prosecutors laid it out like a storybook for the jury. How Johnny started as a street musician, how he built a system that moved drugs through the city with frightening precision, and how it all collapsed because of one text message sent by a careless recruit. The case felt almost unreal. There were no secret recordings of Johnny giving orders, no dramatic videos of him handling drugs. Instead, there were fragments, a text trace, coded ledgers, and the testimony of people who had once called him their boss. They lined up one by one, former friends and trusted allies, each trading pieces of his empire for lighter sentences. Some spoke nervously, their voices shaking. Others spoke coldly, almost eager to bury the man who once commanded their fear. The betrayal was absolute, but Johnny didn't flinch. He sat still, listening, as if he had already accepted that this was the price of being caught. The jurors heard about the warehouses, the money drops, the crates marked JC in faint ink. As always, they heard about the fear that kept his name from being spoken aloud and the missing people who had crossed him. They didn't see a street musician who lost his way. They saw the architect of a criminal empire, and their decision came quickly. The verdict was guilty on every major charge: drug trafficking, organized crime, money laundering. When the sentence was read, decades in prison, there was no gasp from Johnny, no outburst. He simply lowered his head, as if the sound of the gavel was an ending he had already heard in his mind long ago. The courtroom emptied, but the story didn't fade with him in handcuffs. On the streets of Liverpool, his name took on a strange afterlife. Some spoke of him like a warning, a lesson that no one, no matter how careful, could stay untouchable forever. Others romanticized him, telling tales of the quiet Kingpin who ruled in silence and fell because of the smallest mistake. People whispered about the one text, the one careless message that had undone years of planning, power, and fear. Behind prison walls, Johnny became another number, another inmate in a gray uniform. The guitar that had been his beginning was locked away as evidence, its strings silenced. His empire scattered. Some of his crew disappeared, some were jailed, and others found new bosses to serve. The streets that once carried his shipments barely remembered his touch. Yet, there was something haunting in the way it ended. Johnny Cash didn't fall because of a rival gang, a violent betrayal, or a massive sting operation. He fell because of a single vibration on a burner phone, a harmless text sent by someone who didn't understand the weight of it. One text tore down the walls he built, ripped away the fear he commanded, and left the ghost of Liverpool's underworld exposed in the daylight. His name would never be forgotten, but his empire was gone forever. Proof that even the most careful king can lose his crown with one tiny, ordinary mistake.